He went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now when evening come, he was alone there. But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them, walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It's a ghost." And they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter, verse 28, answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." So he said, "Come." And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid, and was beginning to sink. He cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Then those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Very interesting story. I think it was Helen Keller, a very familiar name to maybe some of us. Helen Keller, it was she who said, "Life is either a daring adventure or it is nothing at all." That was Helen Keller. Those words would ring true no matter who said them. But coming from someone like Helen Keller, who lived a life like herself, they meant and they merit special consideration. Because Helen Keller was born blind. She was born deaf. And she was unable to speak. She somehow found a way, out of utter darkness and into the world around her. And she said these words. So her story, we are told, is one of the great miracles of the 20th century. Millions of people around the world draw inspiration from this very wonderful woman, from her example especially. So today, I'd like to ask you to consider her words. Her words that sounds with hope. Consider her words for the second time. Life is either a daring adventure or it is nothing at all. Now, when you bring this particular saying or words of Helen Keller, when you bring this observation by her into the spiritual realm, it looks something like this. The life of faith is inherently a life of risk. Do you think so? As far as the saying of Helen Keller previously, the life of faith is inherently a life of faith. Now go back to the Bible and take a look at the men and women in this Word of God who did great things for God. And almost without exception, those men and women right in this book are risk takers. They love to take the risk. They weren't afraid to lay it all on the line for God. Consider these examples. Maybe you've heard his story. Noah. Noah built an ark. Another man. Abraham. Abraham left the Ur of the Chaldees to go to the promised land. Promised land. He doesn't know the land. He has not been there. But when God called him, he took the risk. He came from the land of Ur, which is presently the land of Iraq. And he went towards north. And right there in that promised land, which according to the Bible, he didn't even know. Another person who took the risk was this guy, Moses. Moses led the people of God out of Egypt. When God told him to go to Egypt and tell Pharaoh that I want my people go, Moses hesitantly said, I cannot speak. I'm slow of speech. Or nevertheless, he took the risk and led Israel out of Egypt. How about this guy, Joshua? Joshua marched around the walls of Jericho for 13 times total. He took the risk and Jericho fell down. Of course, this famous story in the Bible, David and Goliath, very young man. He had brothers who were serving in the army of King Saul. But yet, nobody dared to face the giant Goliath. And here comes a little boy, a shepherd boy, the youngest among the brothers of David, or the youngest among the sons of Jesse. He asked Saul that he will fight Goliath. He took the risk, and he was victorious. What about this person in the Bible, Elijah? You know, Elijah, he faced down the prophets of Baal. And the challenge was whether God of the heavens was the true God or Baal was the true God. He took the risk. He himself, alone right there on the Mount Carmel, together with hundreds of those people and dozens of Baal's prophets, he became victorious. And this lady, perhaps you know her story, Queen Esther, Hadassah. Her Jewish name is Hadassah. She risked everything right there in the Persian court to save her people from utter annihilation by the king. But because she was a risk taker, they were all saved. Esther. How about this young man, together with his friends? Daniel. Daniel, when they were there captives in the land of the pagan country Babylon, they were asked to eat the king's meat, the king's food. But Daniel said, as young as he is, no, we just want to be vegetarians. We just want to drink water and this food. He took the risk, otherwise he could have been killed together with his friends. And of course, the last but not the least, this man, Nehemiah. Nehemiah led the Jews to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. He asked permission from the Emperor Ahasuerus. I have to go back to my land because it's in total ruins. It was a gigantic task, but he took the risk. Nehemiah was a great builder, and Jerusalem was rebuilt. So, my friends, when you read this book, when you read the Bible over and over again, you discover that the men and women who accomplished great things for God were not content to just accept the status quo. They were not contented of the status quo. They thought that more could be done if only someone would lead the way. And when no one else will step forward, they themselves volunteered. It's a good example and a good admonition to all of us who are just being comfortable in our comfort zone. You know, when our little children come to Sabbath school, what stories that we tell them? Of course, we tell them the stories that I just mentioned about those men and women. We tell them about the great stories of the faith of Noah, stories about the faith of Abraham, Moses, David, tell stories about Daniel and all the rest in the Holy Word of God. We talk about those brave souls who laid it all on the line for God. These are the kind of stories, or these are the kind of people that we hold up before our children as role models. These are the models that we want them, our children, to follow. That is only right and proper, because the life of faith is inherently a life of risk. My friends, if you are unwilling to take a chance, you can never discover what living by faith is all about. Never. If you have to have all the answers before you make a decision, if you're afraid to take a step unless you know things will work out to your advantage, faith will always be a mystery to you. It will just be a mere mystery if we are not willing to take the risk. Of all the stories in the New Testament that teach this particular truth, I know of none more beloved than the story of Peter. You know, Peter walking on the water in Matthew that I read earlier, Matthew chapter 14, 22 to 23. No doubt you've heard that particular story. No doubt, maybe because you are so good in the Bible and you are just founded on the Word of God, you also tell this story to your children. And our children know it by heart. But somehow we never grow tired of it, telling it over and over again. The story of Peter walking on the water. Now the background of the story we are told is very simple. Jesus is on the northwestern side of the Sea of Galilee. Actually, it's a lake, just like Salton Sea, right there in Indio, or in the Coachella Valley. It's just a mere lake. Sea of Galilee is a small lake. It's about 35 miles wide, or length is about 7 miles wide. And it is surrounded by mountains. And you can just imagine, just like here in Southern California, when there's that Santa Ana wind and all this wind goes through right the ravines and valleys and passes through. It's so strong. That's why all of a sudden Galilee will just have this, flash storm. And then so big are the waves that sometimes some of these fishermen get drowned. Now Jesus was right there in northwestern part of Galilee. He was doing his job there, ministering. Now it is late in the day, and Jesus has just performed the great miracle of feeding 5,000 men. He just finished feeding 5,000 men with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Understandably amazed and enthralled by this miracle, the people want Jesus to be their king. They were just so amazed at that miracle. Imagine 5,000, that's just women. Men, excepting women in the count. So if you total me times 2 or maybe times 4, including children, that's a lot of people. Feeding them with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. And so the people said, we want you to be king, to be our king. But Jesus, knowing that their enthusiasm is shallow, refuses them and instead goes off to pray for himself into an isolated place on a mountain. After dismissing the crowd, the day is done, telling them that he would meet them later, and also telling the disciples, go ahead, let's go on the other side, let's have some R&R, rest and recreation. He was so tired. But telling them, go ahead, I'll just follow because I have to have prayer. That's another example that we ought to follow. Despite of the tensions, despite of all the stresses in life, let's not forget to come into a solitary place, a place of tranquility, and be connected with God, to be recharged, to be given again the necessary strength to work for another day. And so he said to his disciples, go ahead, I will meet you on the other side. And this verse is found in verses 22 to 23. And so the disciples took the ship or the boat. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he dismissed them, he went up on the mountainside by himself to pray. Matthew 14, 22 and 23. So far, so good. as the story goes. So as the disciples begin to sail across the lake, across the Sea of Galilee, there was an enormous storm that blew up. From the way the gospel writers tell the story, it seems as if the storm began around 9 p.m. or 9 in the evening or 8 p.m. If you try to decipher the writings of these gospel writers. And it continued all night, from 8 p.m. all night. You have all this storm. Now, given the fact that the Sea of Galilee is nestled against the mountains that surrounds it, this would not be unusual. This was not an unusual storm, except for the fact that most storms come and go rather quickly. Maybe it will not last until the morning, or just a few hours or a couple of hours. But this one was just so terribly strong. And the disciples were there, 12 of them. They are in the boat struggling against the wind, the rain. 9 p.m., 10 p.m., 11 p.m., 12 midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m. Still the storm continues with no sign of letting up. After the 8th or 9th exhausting hours, the disciples were stuck in the middle of the lake. They were dirty, they were drenched, chilled to the bone, weary to the point that they began to wonder if they would ever make it to the shore alive. They were just so terrified. Remember, most of them were fishermen, and they knew the Sea of Galilee. But yet, despite of that experience of being really great professional fishermen, they were so terrified. Now we pick up Matthew's story in verse 25. It says there, during the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. And when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost! Ghost! Help, it's a ghost! I'm just adding some more words there. But it says, it's a ghost! And they cried out in fear. Now, by Roman reckoning, we are told the 4th watch in verse 25 occurred between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. Those are what you call in our time the wee hours of the morning, or the holy hours of the morning. The 4th watch occurred between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. It was sometime during this 3-hour period that Jesus began walking on the water. I hardly need to comment that this is a miracle, but this is a literal miracle, not just a symbol or a parable or a vision. A literal miracle, Jesus walking on the water. Jesus, the man, not a vision or an apparition, no. He was literally walking on top of the rolling waves of the Sea of Galilee. And I don't know how he did it, but that he did it. And there is no doubt. After all, he is the Lord of earth. He is the Lord of heaven. The Lord of the natural and the supernatural. Walking on water would not be difficult for the Son of Man and for the Son of God. Now, when the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. Someone cried out, "It's a ghost!" They were wrong, but it wasn't a bad guess either. After all, it's not every day that you see someone, taking a midnight stroll across a lake in the middle of a storm. We can understand their fear, can't we? We can understand their fear. They've been rowing and rowing and rowing and getting to nowhere. And they cannot seem to make it to shore. So it's 4 or 4:30 in the morning. They are dead tired. Every muscle aches. The wind howls around them. Rain pelts them from every angle. They were cold, tired, and waterlogged. Plus, they are grumpy and hungry and frustrated. Suddenly, someone sees a figure walking right there on the water. I think in that situation, I would say exactly what they said. It's a ghost. It's a ghost. My first thought would be that. Here comes Jesus, and I will not be able to say, here comes Jesus. He's decided to walk on the water in the middle of the storm. I think I'd be one of the fellows saying, shut up, keep rowing because there's a ghost. Verses 27 to 29. But Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid. And then Peter, the impulsive, the impetuous disciple, the sometimes, hard-headed individual, he said, Lord, if it's you, okay, tell me to come to you on the water. And the answer was, come. Jesus said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. Now, my friends, in preparing this message, I had a chance to go back and read a number of commentaries written at the end of the 19th century. Many of them react very negatively to what Peter did. They had a negative reaction to what Peter did on that very fearful night. You know, calling him impulsive, calling him headstrong, calling him foolish for even wanting to walk on water. Why do you have to ask God or go ask that individual or our master to walk on the water when the waves are so strong, the winds are so strong? They're foolish. Some, according to these writers and their commentaries, some even suggested that Peter thought he was better than the others. That completely misses the point, brothers and sisters. That completely misses the point. There is nothing in the text that even remotely suggests that Peter was wrong for wanting to walk on the water. You cannot find it there. That Peter was wrong for wanting to walk on the water. Everything points in the other direction. The reason some commentators don't like what Peter did is because they are the kind of people who would never get out of the boat in the first place. That's the reason. At this point, Peter is not being impetuous. He is not being impulsive. He is not being headstrong. It is not as if he just jumps out of the boat and starts walking. No, that would have been presumptuous and foolish. Matthew is very clear, the writer of this particular story, that Peter asked for permission first. He asked for permission. If it is you, our master, if it is you, Jesus, come. Can I get to you? He asked permission first. If Jesus says no, then Peter stays in the boat. But Jesus didn't say no. He said, come. So Peter came. How can you criticize him for that? We must not miss the force of Jesus' words, my friends. When he said, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid, he used an expression the disciples would immediately understand. You know, the phrase, it is I, is the Greek version of God saying in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, that his name is I am. So when he said, it is I, in the Greek, in the New Testament, in the Greek Aramaic, which is the language of the New Testament, in the Hebrew language of the Old Testament, it is interpreted as I am. In Exodus 3:14. Jesus links himself with the God who in the Old Testament miraculously delivered his people again and again. It's not just that Jesus is saying, don't worry, it's me. I'm not a ghost. It's not just like that. It is his way of saying to Peter and to all of us, I am the Lord God of the universe. I created the wind and the waves, and I sent the storm. And it is the Lord himself who tells Peter to come to him on the water. When Jesus says, my friends, come, you better obey. Brothers and sisters, when Jesus says come, let's obey. When he says walk, we better walk. In Peter's case, he was safer out on the water than in the boat. At that moment, the smartest thing Peter could do was to get out of the boat. Once Peter was fully on the water, he turns to walk toward Jesus. As he walked towards Jesus, his master walks towards him. And everything goes fine until Peter notices the storm all around him. Now remember, the storm has never stopped at that moment. Not yet. The storm has never stopped. During all this commotion, during the rain that has been coming down in sheets, behind him, the little fishing boat bobs out, back and forth out of the water on the rolling waves. And Matthew tells us that when he saw the wind, he was afraid, meaning Peter. When Peter saw the wind, he was afraid. But the wind was there all along. The wind was still there all along. The storm has been raging for hours. It's not as if it let up when Jesus begins to walk on the water. No. The storm was still there when Jesus was still walking on the water. No, Jesus comes to them in the midst of the storm. Jesus, my friends, comes to us in the midst of the storm. Whatever storm you have, whatever challenges you have in this life, Jesus is in that storm of yours. According to verse 32, the wind doesn't die down until Jesus and Peter get into the boat. That was the time the winds and the waves stood still, when they were already in the boat. Now in this sermon, or in his sermon on this passage, the preacher, or a particular preacher, defines faith as concentration on Jesus. This is how he defines faith. Concentration on Jesus. I find that very helpful because we all can get distracted in this life. We all can get sidetracked of the consumerism, of the secularism of this world. We get so sidetracked, especially when the storms of life rage around us. You know, it's not easy to keep your eyes on Jesus in the middle of the night when the raging storm of fear threatens to overwhelm you and me. It's not easy. Now, this text reminds us that not only does Christ control the storm, and not only does He send the storm, He reveals Himself in the midst of the storm. Very often, our purest vision of Christ comes when the storm of life threatens to capsize the tiny boat of our faith. That is the time when we see Him in our purest vision, when this little boat of mine in this life is about to capsize. What do we do then? What do we do then when this little boat of mine in this life is about to capsize? Pray for concentrating faith. Pray for concentrating faith. Then focus on Jesus. And the third, fix your eyes on the Son of God. Let me say it again. The wind always blows around us. The mighty storm comes sooner or later. We have no choice. We have no choice, my friends, or we have no control over them when this storm comes. Today, the sun may be shining. Tomorrow, we may find ourselves toiling against the wind and the rain, tossed about by adversity. Life can turn on a dime. We all know that. Life can turn on a dime. What happened to Peter can happen to any of us. What happened to him can happen to all of us. For a brief moment, he forgets about Jesus and remembers who he is and where he is. He is Peter. He is Peter, a Galilean fisherman who belongs back in the boat. In that instant, he looks down at his feet and sees nothing but water underneath, his mind comes to a quick conclusion. To Peter, his mind came to a quick conclusion. Maybe he was thinking, I'm not supposed to be walking on water. This is impossible. When he lost his concentration on Jesus, he began to sink. He began to sink. As he goes down into the water, he prays one of the shortest prayers in all of the Bible. Lord, save me. That's one of the shortest, in fact, one of the shortest prayer of the Bible. Verse 30. In this case, brevity was the course of wisdom. He has to make it short. Why? Because, my friends, when you are sinking, you don't have time to pray for a long prayer. If you aren't quick about it, you'll get drowned before you get to the point of your prayer. The Bible says, because of the quick and brief prayer of Peter, Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him. And his words to Peter are very important. And to all of us, what did Jesus say in verse 31? You of little faith, why did you doubt? Why did you doubt? In our English version, you of little faith comes out, to 4 words. But in the Greek, if you go to the original tongue of the New Testament, Jesus only used 1 word. And this 1 word says, little faith. That's just one word in the Greek manuscript. Little faith. It's a title. It's a nickname. Jesus called Peter little faith. You little faith, why did you doubt? By the way, where did this conversation take place? Where? It took place in the middle of the lake. It was still pitch dark, very dark, with the wind, still howling, and the rain pelting down and beating down the disciples, and of course the boat. The boat with the other disciples is rocking up and down, few yards away, while Peter and Jesus were having that conversation right there on the lake. Jesus is standing on the water as Peter clutches his arm for dear life. After the Lord pulls Peter up from the brink, he decides that this is what the educators call a teachable moment. A teachable moment. Makaluluoy kay taigsoon kung hapit na tamalunod. Kung kanang hapit na tamalunod, maugin ang panahon nga dali ra katunan og tudluan. That is the point when God pulled Peter out of the brink right there from the sea. It was called a teachable moment. So while they are out on the lake, Jesus shares a few things that will help Peter in his spiritual life and will help also us in our spiritual life. No doubt Peter is muttering under his breath. Peter was muttering under his breath, get me back to the boat. Get me back to the boat. It's so cold. It's so scary here. Get me back to the boat. I promise I'll never pull a stunt like this again. Meanwhile, back at the boat, the other fellows are watching this whole scene taking place. Their mouths were wide open, and their eyes were as big as the saucers. They never dreamed that such a thing was possible. So in verses 22 or 32 to 33, to wrap up this little episode, and when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. My friends, before we leave this familiar story, let me take 2 observations about Peter. First observation, give Peter credit because he was willing to do what no one else was willing to do. There are people in the church who just would love to nod their head, but they are not willing to do. Very unwilling. Give Peter the credit because he was willing to do what no one else was willing to do. Before you come down too hard on Peter for taking his eyes off Jesus, just remember that there were 11 other guys back in the boat that were watching this whole affair. Before you sink, you've got to be out on the water. As long as you stay in the boat, you will never sink. But you'll never walk on water either. You'll never experience walking on the water as long as you are there in the boat. And of course, you will never sink, of course, because you are there in the boat. This is not the story of Bartholomew, one of the disciples, maybe one right there on that boat. This is not the story of Bartholomew walking on the water because Bartholomew stayed on the boat. This is not the story of Matthew walking on the water because Matthew stayed in the boat. This is not the story of James, of Judas, because they were not walking on the water because they were staying on the boat. That was not their story. This is about Peter walking on the water because he was the only one with the courage to get out of the boat and walk on the water. Maybe, my friends, some of the others wanted to walk on the water. Maybe they would have if Peter had stayed out there longer. But give the man credit, my friends. Give the man credit. He did it and he didn't. He did it and they didn't. That's why this story is about him. And the other 11 aren't even mentioned in this story because they were cowards. Number 2 point. When Jesus called Peter little faith, he was not rebuking Peter for attempting too much, but for trusting too little. When Jesus called Peter little faith, he was not rebuking Peter for attempting too much, but for trusting too little. Do you see the difference? Jesus is not saying, Peter, you should have stayed in the boat. Jesus did not rebuke Peter for getting out of the boat. To the contrary, Jesus is really saying, Peter, if you just keep your eyes on me, you could have crossed the Atlantic Ocean. According to the book of John Ortberg, Peter may have been the first one out of the boat, but Jesus' invitation to walk on water is for you as well. But walk on water? What does that mean? If you want to walk on water, according to Ortberg, the author of that book, you've got to get out of the boat. And it helps us answer Jesus' call to greater faith, power-filled deeds, a new way of knowing how to discern God's call, transcends fear, risk faith, manage failure, and trust God. Relating to the story in Matthew 14 to life today, this particular story gives us that experience. And so, my friends, that brings me to my final argument for getting out of the boat. If what I've said hasn't quite convinced you this morning, here is my last word to everyone who listens to this sermon. We are all going to die someday. We are all going to die someday. Some of us will die sooner, some of us will die later, but no one gets off planet Earth alive. We're either going to die in the boat or out on the water. As I write and meditate upon this meditation today, I am 60 years old. I am 60 years old, and frankly, I felt it every day. I feel every day, not that I feel old, I don't know. But I know I'm not 25 years old either. I look at my 3 grandchildren, all of them growing fast, and I see in them not only potential but also enormous energy. They can run circles around me without breaking a sweat. Such is the course of life for all of us. Live long enough and you'll see a younger generation rising beneath you. Generations come and generations go. My father, myself, my son, daughter, and then my children, my grandchildren. No one, my friends, lives here forever. Fathers grow old and die. Little boys, little girls don't stay little forever. Sooner or later, we all have a date with death. List that seemed depressing to all of us, I simply use it to remind myself and all of us that how I spend my life really matters, because I want to be here. I won't want to be here forever. I don't want to be here forever. An older generation taught us the truth this way: only one life will soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. I want to live until the very last moment, fully invested for Christ and His kingdom, doing everything I can to advance His cause in the world, taking risk on the basis of kingdom principles. Staying in the boat may be comfortable and safe, but that's not what the life of Jesus and the life of faith is all about. No. Christ calls all of us, calls you, calls and me, to find out what He is doing in the world, and then to fling ourselves wholeheartedly into His cause. In the end, who looks better? Who looks better? Peter, who tried and sunk, or the other 11 who didn't even try? There's a reason why we don't preach about the other 11. Have you heard of preachers preaching the other 11 in the boat? No, because they played it safe. They wanted to be safe. Only Peter took the risk. That's why we're still talking about him for more than 2,000 years. And I realize, my friends and brothers and sisters, that it's risky to walk on water. It's risky. It's possible that you might sink. It's possible that I might sink. But you'll never know until you get out of the boat. May the Lord bless us.